Welcome to the Iron John podcast. I'm Timothy Young, and for this episode, I recorded a conversation with poets Jonathan Stensland and Jesse Dermody about poetry at the Minnesota Men's Conferences. We talked about its founder, Robert Bly, and the value of poetry to ourselves and the conference community as a whole. Because of our friendship and history together, this conversation wanders many diverse landscapes about the roles of poetry in our lives. If you are interested in attending the next conference, October 7th through October 12th, 2025, check out our website at minnesotamensconference.com. Hello, Jonathan.
Tim, hi. It's good to meet with you.
Hi, Jesse.
Hi, Tim. Good to be here.
I was hoping that today we could talk about why poetry is so important to our Minnesota men's conferences. Obviously, these conferences were started by a poet, probably one of the finest poets of the 20th century. One of the things that Robert Bly did is he participated with James Hillman and Michael Meade, two of the early teachers, and produced this wonderful book, The Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart. I just wanted to start our conversation with this quote from James Hillman. This is from Rag and Bone Shop of the Heart, and it begins the section on language. Hillman writes, "Poems, beyond their human meanings, beyond their human feelings, enliven Nanola, what Trobrianders call moral intelligence. By teaching men to speak well, men learn to speak up and out. Isn't this precisely what is needed, according to Confucius, to refound society?" In today's world, we need to refound society and utilize language with moral intelligence.
I remember that quote, I think, where it was that the one that has, to begin to reform society, you have to begin with the language itself, right?
Yes.
Reviving the language, or somehow there was a recentering of the language, though, in a whole fresh field of meaning and so on.
That's
like
right.
You have to bring the language back to life. Maybe that's a really good clue to why and how it was that poetry ended up being the vessel by which we got the whole conferences moving into the water and across the water. Poetry really was our canoe, it seemed like to me. It's what got us into the water somehow, into the work. It got us there, it carried us.
If poetry is the canoe, I think stories are probably the big barge.
Yes, they played a big role, for sure.
Yeah.
There is something about how poetry itself would just transform the room. The stories definitely do that too. But do you remember how, they would really transform our bodies, so that our bodies were really in the room in a way that just before the poetry started, we weren't there that way. And then suddenly, boom, we were. I remember that.
I had, known about the conference for 15 or 20 years. So I feel like I came in already a part of things, especially because of the poetry and how much I love the electricity that poetry adds to any amount of oxygen in the air. It's great to breathe it in when it's in the room.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yep.
While it was years before, I felt like you did, Jesse, that somehow I felt like I knew the place of the space, even though it had only been going 3 years or 4 years once I finally got there. But by knowing Robert's poetry, intimately and deeply, I felt already like I knew my way there and knew what the place would be, even though it was still shocking to see that many guys back then, like 100 guys. But definitely the poetry, it delivered something in advance of actually getting to the conference. The poetry of the conference, or that's the life of the conference, got to us, it sounds like, before we got to the conference, which is really saying something.
I was in graduate school and Robert Bly stopped by Michael Dennis Brown's seminars a couple times because Robert then had an evening at Hennepin Methodist Church to talk about Iron John. I went because Robert was a poet that I had met. Poetry was actually the vehicle that got me into that first evening with the story. And of course, whenever Robert brought stories, he always filled the room with poetry also.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the things about poetry, and this is how I explain it to some of my family or friends, a poem is a personal vehicle that carries you into the universal. Whereas a story is universal that can carry you back into the personal. And I think that's why it's essential that conferences have both story and have poetry. And no one was better at it than Robert Bly.
He had just this incredible both body of experience with people, with groups, but with that whole dynamic of what could be, what a poetry reading could be, what it really was, what was going on psychologically, what the room might be asking of him implicitly, like, hey, just keep us laughing for a while so we don't have to go down. Remember Robert's analysis of what a poetry, what the space was that poetry was being read into was pretty impressive.
Mm-hmm.
In all these subtle ways that I think most people who read poetry probably are still not aware of. After maybe 20 or 30 years of just reading maybe 2 or 3 times a year, but Robert going out once a month for a week essentially was what his workload was. He would take 1 week to 10 days to maybe 15 per month, and then try to come back to try to win himself 2 to 3 weeks of, being his own free agent at home to be able to work on poetry. There's something about his being aware of what that bigger body is that we all contribute to when we're there witnessing poetry happening around us, being read, said, and so on. It was pretty amazing.
Jonathan, you said Robert knew what a poetry reading could be. What could a poetry reading be? And how was it for him? But how was it? I mean, it seems to me like I've seen videos of him. It seems to me like it was a very extremely energetic and musical experience.
There is that. Robert was, wouldn't you say, Kim, a really good reader of the room?
Absolutely.
Like his sense of what might the feeling be like. Imagine this, for instance, like a 747 is something, we can do a lot of things alone, maybe even build a wagon that's pulled by horses and get it going. You just can't build a 747 on your own and get it up into the air. But there's something about a poetry reading. It can be as complicated in a way as that, when it's really going strong, where that thing it's made of everybody that's in that room somehow becoming waking up to the poetry.
Yeah.
And Robert was able to sense, okay, 2 people are awake now 10. Now there's 20. We can go down. It's like he was aware and able to count how many psyches were joining him, were really there, and then he would go. So, I mean, that's just one little portion of that, I think.
Yeah. I think that a good poetry reading is actually a ritual experience.
Mm-hmm.
In the ritual, Robert was exceptional at connecting with the people in the room and connecting with the other world and connecting both sides, all sides at the same time when he was at his best.
Yeah.
And I think that's one reason why he also loved to bring music in. music filled the spaces that the words and the thoughts couldn't fill for those people who hadn't had enough experience with poetry.
Jesse, you've heard those recordings, I'm imagining, of Robert doing that typical thing that he would do with David Whetstone, with Marcus, with the tablas and the sitar going.
Yeah,
So
several of
you're
those.
fully aware of just how that particular kind of poetry anyway would just kind of levitate on that music, on that sound. It was definitely an environment in which those words were set free. They're kind of like set loose on the music somehow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because you are a musician.
I think that poems, the good ones, are meant to be performed, and if they're any good, they are music, and they're
Uh-huh.
very melodic. It's like reading musical notations of the song "Hey Joe" on a piece of paper and just hearing it inside your head, reading the musical notation, compared to listening to Jimi Hendrix play the song. Extremely fantastic version of Hey Joe that I've listened to probably 5,000 times, and it moved. You said that Robert Bly had that connection to the spirit world when he was reciting the poems, and he could bring people in. Yeah, that's what music is about, and I think that poetry essentially, if it's any good, is also music and highly
Yeah.
musical. So that's why I love Bly's work so much. I know sometimes he got critiqued for not being musical. I thought, well, no, actually, he's very musical and very melodic.
Yeah.
And I know he played hand drums, and there's good reason why he did.
I agree with you. There was a attention to sound in Robert that wasn't to try to make lines rhyme, but this sense of there being sonic content, that the line itself, the sound of the line, was
Mm-hmm.
itself content like clay in a sculptor's hand. And you really
Yeah.
get that through Robert for sure.
And especially when he started moving into writing his ramages.
Uh-huh.
The ramages where he focused on the sound of a syllable. And that sound is repeated over and over in those short poems. I mean, he he actually devised the name ramage.
That's
Uh,
right.
yeah, he came up with that label himself. So that, for instance, a poem that had the sound ooh, you might find all sorts of words in there like moon and through and screw and I doubt you. He would take a sound and develop the poem around that sound. Knowing how Robert wrote, he would start with that sound and follow whatever came into his mind. That sound was the seed for all of the images that followed. And that was what was so wonderful about the ramages. And actually, it's the same thing that he did earlier. He wanted to focus specifically on the sounds in the ramages.
I think there was something in Robert that was genuinely and immediately interested in what the mystery was that was going on
Yes.
at any given time, and that the sound for him too would, unlike maybe a composer who's composing toward just really making something happen fresh in music and in sound itself, Robert was really trusting that there was a mystery to this whole thing, and he was just digging in. Like,
Yeah.
when you say this way, this certain kind of, and there is certain music that's just innately, or how do you put it? Like, you could say that a seed, for instance, is just full of sound that you have to pour water into to get the sound to come out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, like wind through a trumpet, you have to pour water through a plant, and boom, that whole plant itself is the sound, that seed. It's everything that seed had to say is going to become that plant. And there's just something about Robert's way with sound, was like in service of that. Like, he was bringing sound in to fill in some kind of notes that were news. Each of the notes of music that would be in a phrase or a line, because they were so connected to. He would trust a very clumpy kind of word. Like, remember in Morning Poems, for instance, that line, "My heart is a calm potato."
Yeah. Yeah.
There's plenty of music in that, and yet there's this kind of folksy something. There's this stuff. There's just a suchness to it. There's this his poetry was something you could feel, you could touch.
And that's what he brought into the conferences.
Uh-huh.
That process, a poem filled those spaces in the conferences also for men.
Yeah.
I mean, how many men never read a poem aloud until they came to a men's conference?
Hmm.
Suddenly men are buying books of poetry. Men are investigating, their ancestral poets.
Mm-hmm.
It was there. It was a part of the fertility of the conferences.
And Robert's just the very essence of where he came in the poetic life of the country in the
Mhm.
50s, like that, and kind of an announcing a death and a rebirth, like a new frontier and an opening. He was already doing something dynamically. He'd already played through something dynamically, I should say, with poetry itself, which you could see the thing with the men's work and so on is a replay in a way of that very kind of dynamic. Declaring a certain kind of male model defunct, bankrupt,
Yep.
and saying that doesn't mean there's no currency in the place of maleness or manhood and so on, but it's this pattern or this path that is bankrupt. The thing that led to John Wayne is pretty much bankrupt.
Right.
And so we really actually need to start rebuild an economy all over again. And then we did, just like that poetry that he did. And we did it with a completely different imagination, I think, than most things that are probably going right now. Because the central concern probably in a lot of situations is, I don't know, maybe a man, how am I going to save my own ass? Or how am I going to figure out some way to crack open life? Might be what's going on with a lot of men, but maybe it's a lot of other things too. And I think we certainly carried those concerns. But there was something with the poetry as a dimension that was a companion for us. It was like a faithful horse. It was like, we could say all these things that it was like. The
Yep.
poetry itself was like a companion animal, a spiritual something that was coming with us. We weren't alone because there was all this poetry that was with us.
I want to ask Jesse this. I want to take what you said there about poetry as a companion that's carrying us, but you're a musician, Jesse, and when you're performing, the companion is you're not riding the companion is actually inside of you, carrying you forward. And I think that's the way you write poetry too, also, isn't it? I mean, it's coming from inside of you, the poetry itself.
It's so bewildering for me to try to describe what is the driving force of music and poetry that I just love so much to be a I wouldn't even say I create it. I'm a part of creating it. The
Yep.
stuff just happens, you know.
Yep.
If any human being is attuned to a certain reality, of fine-tuned perception of this physical reality, this world. I'm looking at dandelions right now, and I'm actually seeing them, and I
Yep.
can go up and smell them, and it smells good, and I know I can eat them, and it's nutritious. I'm not afraid of dandelions. That sort of reality and close-knit perception of it even touching the earth. Today, I was digging holes to prepare myself, touching the earth to prepare myself for mostly listening to you guys and adding a little bit. But the driving force, me touching the earth, me having a real experience of the breeze tickling the hairs on my skin, and I feel it,
Hmm.
hear it, when I experience another person, it's a grief-stricken experience because I know it's very, very brief. that's the drive. Grief is a driving force. Grief is my companion. It's inside me and it's outside of me.
Uh-huh.
And my parents have passed on. That's the funny thing. I I was hesitant to come. I don't know why to the conferences. I knew about him for a long time. I even had some correspondence with Robert Bly. I mean, he was kind enough to tell me what was good and a lot of what was not good about my poetry, and he helped me out. He didn't have to. And I was just reluctant for some reason. I wasn't ready. Then my mom died, then my dad died, and I was very ready to come. And I came. And I needed a community of men who understood the grief of poetry. I think that a poem without deep grief isn't going to be very enjoyable to read. It's not going to have the connection to the other world, to the spirit realm. For some reason, grief is a great conduit for spirit and soul. It's like Carlos Santana said, if a song doesn't have the blues, it's probably not worth listening to. It's the same thing with poetry and everything, music. I make music with my brother and some with my girlfriend too. They're both very soulful human beings. I'm very lucky. They guide me. I flounder energetically oftentimes. I don't know what to do, or I have too many ideas and it gets messy. But having the right people in my lives, like you guys and my brother, my girlfriend, and certain people who are also artistically attuned, it makes playing music more enjoyable and listening to others recite poems very deeply enjoyable. I hope that wasn't too much of a tangent, guys.
That was gravy.
Yeah. One of the things that we've done consistently over, well, it's 41 years now, is having poetry every day at the conference. I mean, we always start sessions with poems and the different voices from different men reading a poem, their own individual lives come through that poem, because most often they're not assigned a poem, they pick a poem. So we get to know a little bit more about the internal being that is reading that poem. And that's something that, as men, because there's a bit of defensiveness and competition, competitiveness between men, no matter how much we pretend it's not there, it's always a little bit there. What, I've got 5 living brothers. I know that the competition is there regularly. Our internal beings are moving at all times. Poetry helps us take a snapshot at a certain time. And that poem then can tell the listener or the reader about that moment in eternity. Poetry has that magical ability so that we can connect with one another at a level that we've never connected before. And I think that's what actually happens at the conferences, something that surprises so many men once they come back, that they have connected in ways they may not have even known existed.
But I think we are both all probably feeling aware of, though, is how it would have been interesting, for instance, to have done this conversation with each of us having poetry of the other two
Yeah.
on the table in front of us. And because we would be getting examples immediately right now of where I'd go turn to you and say, what happened in that one line there? This is one thing I could for sure feel this.
Yeah.
On and on, because we can appreciate, I think, what we've each done and how poetry has brought each of us to life. We understand how poetry brought the other one to life. We can just tell and taste it. And Tim, even with you, with years before I ever knew you, poems that have come from when you were 18 or 23, maybe more like that, 22, written in Mexico, or some of this thing here over there. You just can feel this whole arc of a person, of somebody coming to life. It's just really interesting. And it was just great to have the poetry right there with us when doing something like this. I'm realizing we almost need to have it, because we could go down about 13 different wells to talk about the way it was important and the way it mattered. And yet anybody listening to us right now who doesn't know and who hasn't experienced that would probably be at a loss. Maybe feel some longing for it, but at a bit of a loss as to, well, how does that work? But remember when we would get these, like, how many different political poems, like in Sleepers Joining Hands, or these kinds of poems that Robert would write, or Thomas McGrath might do around town, and you would get this is an incredible dash from a thought, a sensibility, a sentiment into an emotion, into an image that just blows you away. And boom, that kind of movement in the space of poetry is one thing we're hardly able to do by talking about it.
Yeah, we can't do it simply by talking about it. We have to actually experience the poem itself
Yeah.
at that moment, because the poem connects us, the way I interpret it, the poem connects us to that invisible realm of eternity in which we are all connected, whatever word you want to use for that. But a good poem, it actually carries us into a place beyond language. The older I get, the more I appreciate that. But a poem it takes us there, it guides us there. It's the road sign along my personal journey. And when I look backwards in my own personal trip as a poet, probably the most famous poem that I've ever written was Men Don't Dance in America, which I wrote before I even knew there was such a thing as a men's conference. There was something in me that yearned for this kind of participation, this kind of experience in life, where I wrote it 3-4 years before there was a first Minnesota Men's Conference. And curiously, it was the old woman poet, Meridelle LeSueur, who heard me at an open mic and suggested to my eventual publisher that he publish that poem as a broadside.
That was Meridel's idea?
It was Meridelle LeSueur.
Huh.
It was an old woman. When I started hearing all the stories in all the men's conferences and hearing about the old woman at the edge of the woods who sends you on your way with some sort of wise guidance, it's suddenly, oh, I'm thinking Meridelle. I mean, she was in her late 80s, early 90s at that time. I mean, she was the crone at the edge of the woods that I had met, helped me on the way.
I was wondering, I really love that, this honoring her presence in how this came to be. And I think behind each of us, we probably can identify some mysterious motion of a woman made that moved us kind of deeper into this place. I was curious with something about words themselves. Jesse, you had put something out there. Remember that this last week, and that word yesterday?
Oh yes. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe we could go to that as a curious phenomenon, Tim, too, about language. How, in some sense, poetry is like the language speaks. When language needed a language, it invented poetry. When we need to say something, we invented language. But it's like language itself wants to do something. It wants to get up and show us what it can do. And one of the things that it can do so curiously is it tunes us to one of its words. And so there was something that happened. Do you remember what it was? I think it was the fact that the fire had gotten out yesterday, right? With the day that we had communicated, the fire that it was close to your house at that time had been a threat yesterday, but rain had come yesterday in this context. And so then yesterday was this really curious word to me, Tim, that became like yesterday. The meaning of the word yesterday itself is rain that came, something that came.
Yeah.
That got to us, some gift that came. That's the real meaning of yesterday somehow. I can't even quite recall. But then you had been working on a piece, Jesse, of art that you decided to title Yesterday.
Yeah. And I had no idea why I was calling it yesterday until, a month later, you and I had this conversation and poetic conversation about the word. And
Yeah,
it was a palm of water that put out the fires that would have otherwise consumed my studio,
right.
you know? Yeah. And that's why I called it yesterday. When I look at the piece now, it has that deeper meaning of watery yesterday and rain and tears
Mhm.
that might otherwise get out of control, chaotic. It's the keeper of deeper meditation.
Yeah, words and poetic phrases, just bits of lines even have for so often in my lifetime been like canteens that,
Yeah.
that one line will be like something that can carry something a long, long way, that you can take it with you and drink it later, like it's really there. And life being so mysterious and there being so much that we truly have to digest in order to take in the nourishment that life delivers. There's something about that, Tim, too, that I'm thinking about in terms of our appreciation of what poetry, how it matters in the men's work, is that it has so many different times given names and provided something that could hold the thing, like the small group names that we had that Robert and James and Michael would give names, like men who listen from under the bed, or
Yeah.
men who patrol the edges of the fields of conflict, or the poetry gave this tremendous capacity to branch out with ideas that we didn't have. That it would put philosophy, it would be like a forest of philosophy in front of us that no philosopher had written. Language itself had come in and produced all
Yep.
of this philosophical content that then we later on might work our way into. That part of it was fascinating. Jesse, I wish you could have been here for that part of it. But that's so much of what we did acquired a name that clearly came from the poetic place, not from something else. You know, it did come from a curriculum. It didn't come from a university. It didn't come that way. It came
No.
directly out of the poetic nature of of our marrow somehow.
I feel like I was there in many ways because the book Iron John and the book The Reagan Bowen Shop of the Hearth, I'm surmising a lot of the material from the book was taken from real experiences, community experiences with men that Robert had. Perhaps at the conferences, perhaps just traveling the country. I don't know. I'm surmising right now, but
Right.
how else he could learn and make so many phenomenal psychological and poetic connections.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's really like what you call, Tim, getting shoulder to shoulder with other men
Yeah.
in a sacred, a sacred space where it's not a matter of competition, but a matter of recalibrating our inner life so that I personally, when I'm recalibrated, when I act with greater intent. So, yeah, I hope I didn't cut in on you, Jonathan, because
Oh no, I
sorry.
actually like that.
Yeah.
You
Oh,
like dogs at the dog park? I don't think I've never met a dog at a dog park that complained because another dog ran up and, and took something, you know. But I really love that where you went with that too, with that.
Yeah.
And that's really it.
No, I think poetry also brings a sense of integrity. It's really hard to lie in poetry.
Huh.
Anyone who's familiar with poetry is going to, if you try and lie, they're going to pick up on it right away because there's a tone that comes from deep inside of us or deep inside of the poetry. If you've experienced enough with poets and poetry and human beings in the natural world, you sense what is a lie and what is not.
Well, in humor too, in funny ways
Yeah.
that if you try, we could try and lie right now in the poetry, but the lie would betray itself.
Yeah.
Like I could start out with the first line of the poem being right now, like every night is Taco Tuesday in my house. And everybody knows it's not true. The poem knows it's not true, but we could go on, with the effort. The poem, I think poetry would agree to go, I'll go with you on that.
No, sure, because the words themselves, the words are neither lying or not lying.
Right.
It's the tone that's coming through the poem or the line and your voice that tells us what's true or not. And humor is so necessary on taking words and throwing them upside down,
Yeah.
turning them
Taking your point,
inside out.
taking your point, Tim, about lying and so forth is, do you remember the first wave of the first time Trump got elected? And there were a lot of guys out there lying back then. And I knew in my gut, because of these laws, there's kind of like these universal laws about what poetry will allow, what language will or will not allow. And I thought, half these guys are going to go crazy before 18 months are out.
Yeah.
And sure enough, they start to go insane because you can't abuse the vehicle of poetry that way. If you try to, it will fuck you up. It really will. And and you might even improve through getting fucked up by it. It might bring you through a few, what's it called, incarnations.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's sure going to kill you and start you over again a few more times and so on. And you can grow. You could tell, when there's certain times where your own voice, poetically, when you're outgrowing something, where you'll start to, have you experienced that, hate the poetry or hate? I've had that before where I've become a poetaster, like I remember a certain time in my 20s. Or if you feel like somehow, okay, when I wrote that poem, I was really in that desire and I lived it. Then you start to feel like you're not even legitimately the reader anymore of a poem you wrote, because you wrote it from a different place and you're not that guy. It might be an extraordinary poem and beautiful, but I know times when I've thought, I'm not legitimately the one to read that poem anymore. I better go on and write some other poem that I can read,
Well, that's when you become an actor and put on a persona, That's why we have friends like Walton Stanley and actors like that and storytellers, right?
That know how to do it.
Yeah.
Jesse, I think you're just going through, you brought a book out of one of your sort of transformations, would you say? Like, were you sort of in a 13-year period of something, or what's the title of your most recent book?
Womb's Dark Waters. First line in the book is, from the womb's dark waters we have been born.
Yeah.
And my own incarnation, and guess what? Poetry kicked my ass.
Yeah.
To be able to write this book, I had my poetry said, you're going to be hurting for a while, both physically and psychologically. It was a birthing process.
Yep.
Yeah.
And part of it, I physically got really injured in my abdomen and got the same injury that a lot of pregnant women get during the childbirthing process.
Yep.
Of the fascia. And so I had to go through that, and that was a part of my writing process. That it was very joyful to write. To get to that joy was a lot of pain.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and darkness, beautiful, luscious, fairly long walks in the dark of night, sometimes through the woods, feeling my way with my feet on the right path, having to get my invisible antennae out so I'm not running headlong into a craggly pine tree.
It seems like kind of appropriate to say that poetry kind of like grabs us by our hair and drags us through what it wants to show us. At any time of our life. And like, Tim, I can tell in your poetry how poetry kind of grabbed your hair and dragged you through certain kinds of terrain.
Is that why I'm bald now?
I have a feeling that poetry could actually grab your invisible hair too. I don't think you're going to get away from it just by getting bald. But how the imagery and the details and so on. It's like poetry wanted to stuff your face right in it.
Oh, absolutely.
In horsetail ferns or fiddle ferns and the whole works, that all those details that come in. I was just reading your things about a week ago and seeing that again. And Jesse, what you're talking about there, where it's like, so poetry has been kind of like the tutelary spirit really of our men's work. It really has been. We've relied upon stories to work our imaginations, to work our minds and our bodies and so forth into shape in some kind of way, to lend shape to what we're doing on any given weekend. But the thing that's worked us when we're away from a conference or whatever, it seems to be that the poetry is what really does it. And what any of the ones that gets captured by poetry itself has definitely done things like this. And I, like you, Jesse, too, I've had experiences in the poetry, but it would let me know, it's going to be about 120 days. It'll be 120 days of this particular thing. Sometimes you're given it a warning, even, but a shape, a clarity, a real clarity about what's in play. But it's so raw, the creative thing, you can't predict it, you can't tell it where it's going to go or what it's going to do. And if you tried, you would kind of just hate it. It would suck.
What I find is that the stories provide a matrix for me to understand my own poems.
Huh.
The poems are coming out of me. The poems are very personal. Quite often, the stories help give me a ground so I can interpret my own poems, so I can understand what my experiences are all about, how they fit in a wider sense. I'm working on a manuscript right now, and when I start, I don't know what is going to come out. I don't know what's going to end up on the page. Once it's on the page, then I utilize the stories in my personal experience to help me understand more deeply what actually came out of me. Way back inside of me, I call it the silent witness.
Huh.
There's a part of me that is just witnessing the birth and life itself. And it doesn't have language yet.
Huh.
Poetry offers language and words, but I need something on the outside of me to help understand what is actually happening inside of me.
How do dreams play for you on that level? I'm finding that a lot of the things you're talking about with story are really, they come to me as dreams, that anticipate something.
Absolutely.
Anticipation.
I was just putting together some poems. For the first time this weekend, I'm going to read poems for my extended family. I had to find poems that are accessible to my family, because they're almost all working class people. There's a lot of things that I can't offer them. And now I lost my train of thought. My family stuff just interfered with all of this.
Well, you've been touching on the word personal and about poetry.
Yep.
And personal. My guess is you're wondering, I suppose, how personal is this material? Like, can you actually even present it to your family without it getting wiped out? Or are you finding I can present this to my family because it's personal but enduring? Or what is it that's touched you there?
I had to find poems where my family would have common ground with me. For instance, a poem about my dead brother.
Uh-huh.
So they'll feel the grief that is in the poem. But in that poem itself, it comes out of a dream. My brother died at 9 years old from a brain tumor. But the poem comes out of a dream I had maybe 30 years ago, where I dreamt that I met my dead brother as an adult in the dream, and that became the poem.
Yeah.
And now I can share that poem with my extended family. It will give them a vehicle not to be stuck totally in fear and grief of dying.
Right.
They'll be able to hear this poem and say, oh, maybe he really is an adult on the other side of the veil.
Oh, there we go. I feel like we're naming something that belonged in the conversation that we didn't know well enough to invite in at the very beginning, but when saying this about dreams.
Yeah.
I remember so much poetry really is just giving a title to a dream that you've had.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't even give titles to my poems, but I give titles to the dreams, like Descending Mount Egypt, or the tornado that comes off Mount Tamalpais, or, there were all these, I would always give a name, it seemed like inevitably, to the dream. And I suppose it was because I wanted to know how to find my way back there.
Yeah.
So that one I needed a title for. Now with the poetry, interestingly enough, I'm not all that interested in going back to a poem I've written before. I'm way more curious about the ones I'll write, today, for today.
Uh-huh.
The way that you were talking about too, Jesse, about, where you're having an experience right then and there, you're alive as you're writing the poem, because you're experiencing the day that is, and then the wonders of what comes in through poetry, the And I tend to attribute different gifts that poetry brings to also, or associate them to, or attribute to a poet that made that gift most clear to me too, who you recognize, oh, he was a really good recipient of that particular gift that poetry can give, like William Stafford. William Stafford's voice that has so many different pitches in it. And Jesse, you have a lot of that when you read too, where your one phrase that you might say will have a lot of different little pitches where your voice needed to be in order to get the thing said, that it couldn't have been said without all those pitches involved. I find that too in a lot of poetry, and also in stories, that wherever there is this thing where language and image are traveling together, boy, does that become really important to be able to get the pitch of the thing, the tone of it, almost as if water's voice is its volume. Like water can have a voice that's as tiny as like a little seed, or it can have a voice that's as big as a canyon. And it depends entirely on what really is there. Analog.
Mm-hmm.
I mean by that, like whatever the water of life is engaged in and doing right at this very moment is going to have a lot to say about how you get it in terms of a poem. I have to hand the baton off whether any of you is ready, because I can't keep going in that direction or I'll get everybody lost. It'll come back around.
Oh, the dream thing. I have thought of it like this. Writing a poem is, I'll be damned if it's not the same or very similar to dreaming.
Yeah.
That pure unconscious state. When I'm not in that deep dream trance while I'm writing poems, it's not daydreaming. It's very focused.
Yes.
And my senses are acute and all that. But if somebody interrupts me, even inadvertently, while I'm having that poem dream, and I get cut off, I get distracted from it.
Yeah.
It's like when you wake up from a dream, it disappears, it dissipates.
Yeah.
What would have happened is gone.
Yeah.
And it's the same with writing. That's why I kind of have to be off on my own a little bit. I put up my shoulders if I'm in a crowd, and hunch over if I'm writing a poem. And you don't get it now. He's writing a poem. He might get pernickety if you interrupt his dream. But still time for myself. At least 2 hours sitting in a chair doing nothing but recalibrating and waiting for maybe the next poem, maybe not. It don't matter. I'm sitting there and I'm in full germination. And then the rest of the day I'm better for it. I feel like I did the thing, in the morning. Mm-hmm. So now I'm the rest of the day. Yeah. It's hard to come by. Robert Bly and you guys, you bring in a lot of that unself-conscious musical poetic material that stems from something that's more than just the puny intellect. It's gifts from beyond the intellect. It's the rest of the body.
Yep.
All organs. I've explained this before a little bit. It's my toes, it's my fingernails, it's everything. My cells are constantly being rejuvenated as a human being. And that rejuvenation sparks poems, if I'm aware of it. And the heart has the greatest healing and rejuvenating power. And that's what's missing in our culture. And that's what the conference has. It has heart energy beyond belief. So I come for selfish. I've come for many reasons that I like. But one of the reasons is I feel primed for new creations through the conferences. If I come twice a year, it holds me through until the next conference, to be honest with you.
Yep.
I feel more ready to create.
What you're saying, Jesse, reminds me so much of something. We've never ever done this before. We've never linked, I don't think, this image, but methylations with genetics, with epigenetics. Tim, this notion of like a chromosome will be spun tight. There's these two really significant things that come with epigenetics, so that we have our own genetics, but we inherit. There's this heritable kind of memory around the gene that codes it and says, read this, don't read this. These are not the droids you're looking for. And that all kinds of things where there's all of this other material that is around that. And there's something about the liveliness, Jesse, that you were bringing to what you're talking about there, that reminds me that what we're doing with poetry and with the conferences themselves, and by being there, we are rewriting the ways of reading ourselves. And the poetry does that as well. It's as if we are shaking off certain things and fresh things are getting written in. Like, this is real. When a poem is getting written, it's a real rewrite of some kind of fundamental instruction about something that has to do with the very essence of what makes us. When my daughter was about 3, she wanted to go to churches because she'd seen the architecture a lot. She would keep going, "Is that a church? Is that a church?" And she started wanting to go into one. So one Sunday, I decided, okay, we're going to go look for a church. So I put her on the hood of my truck, before going, and I said, "Carmina, who made you?" And she said, "I did, out of potatoes, red potatoes." And I thought she still remembers being in the womb.
Yeah.
And her DNA knows it made her.
Yep.
Like, it's not going, "I don't know who fucking made this, but they fucking sucked," And it led me into really understanding that one of the beautiful roles probably that praise plays on this planet is, I think the DNA likes to have, like, the iris of the eye that it designed. It wants its work praised.
Yep.
That the DNA, it's sort of like God's strategy. Like, if I'm going to get into my creation, I think I'll become the tiniest thing in it, but pervasively in it. And then suddenly you have DNA in everything. And it has an aptitude and an appetite to have its work praised. And we can write poetry forever based on that. The amount of stuff to be praised, for instance.
And it's not just the DNA that wants that. It's actually much bigger than that. I know this has happened to me.
It's the minerals themselves, you think? Like the little mineral that
it's the minerals. I walked into B. Dalton bookstore and the Tao Te Ching fell off of the shelf in front of me. And I was in my early 20s. I've had that happen a couple other times where a book of poetry will just jump out at me. Or I'll pick something up not knowing anything about it. And suddenly it's become such a part of me, and it's exactly what I needed at that moment.
That it's that psychoactive, that the books themselves will,
And it connects me to the wider universe, and it propels me into the world of poetry, into the world of spirit, into the world of music. There's something that's beyond synchronicity.
Yep.
That is pushing all of this. And that's why I look back over all the years that I've been participating through this work, and I have found men who actually understand what I'm talking about.
Right.
They have had similar experiences, and they've had nowhere to talk about those experiences.
But, it's really interesting, though, that the thing that you're talking about, I was just thinking as you were, our community is one that's very much made of guys that have had experiences.
Yeah.
Life has presented itself to them as something to experience. And Tim, I was going to joke when you said you walked into a bookstore, and I was just going to finish the line, and, I walked into the bookstore, I sat down, and it put its head on my lap. Like a dog that wants to eat that, That's like, poetry is just like, it's just impossible to stop. It grants you the next approach, the next slant at how you're going to experience what's right in front of you.
Yep.
It's not just something on a page, for sure.
Yeah. We got just a couple more minutes. Is there anything you want to say to wrap this up?
Is this notion about our community, this companionship of the other guys, because it's so germane to the men's conference. And we're just now getting there in terms of the poetic companionship. I remember, like, when you were talking about the competitiveness, I remember very early on feeling way more competitive with my understanding of my poetry and how it might, and when wanting to champion it and stuff. Now I feel it very differently. Like, the poetry has become very companionable. Like, I'm interested in what anybody else is doing. And I suppose it's because I realized, well, I'm almost 60. I might be running out of time to enjoy other people's poetry. I get to enjoy mine in the tomb. But there is something that becomes very generous and curious. But I also think it's because our community is maturing. Like we're going through a renaissance almost. We're approaching a renaissance. Or something like that, where all the old ingredients and the old elements are coming to the fore. It's as if they're representing themselves for us to assemble for the next steps or something like that. Because it's just different. You notice how that weekend we did in Wisconsin? I think it totally took care of itself. It's like it knew what to do.
Right. Yeah.
We just have to fill in.
Yep.
There's something about this that just really got me curious, and that's why I was wondering, like Jesse, like what do you feel in this community sense with poetry? You write it alone, but when we're together and we start to go and you start to get spontaneous, it turns out it can be together too. Like it can be with us here.
Yeah, it's what fine-tuned purpose does any poem have? And usually I find the humble purposes. It's not a thing of grandiosity. It's not a thing of
Yep.
making money off of the poem or getting as well known as possible for writing oh so fantastically. It's not that. It's what small fine-tuned purpose do these four stanzas have in any other person's life? And I find that through association. Like Tim, you have brought into the conference some of your own poems spontaneously. You just say, "Oh, this poem I wrote 25 years ago about a bear that I dreamed about." That is those sorts of connections only can happen in the right atmosphere. It's lovely to find those associations for a poem. If I were to recite a poem, I want to make sure that it has greater meaning. I want to make sure that it is not a floundering presentation. Otherwise, the poem is just sitting on the damn page. And I don't even think poetry is essentially words. I'm very skeptical that a poem is words.
Uh-huh.
I could the rest of my life and not write another single poem down, and I'd still be a poet. So long as I'm living in a certain manner.
Us old guys, when we see something worth praising there with the younger guys, we do it. And that's part of being a man in a men's conference.
Yeah, and it might even be something as just the way the person is standing there, or or the waiting that they did before they decided to say a thing that they said.
Mm-hmm.
There's an awful lot to notice.
Yep.
Of realness that is coming closer and closer when you're in that, or stepping back away or whatever, but it's really in the room.
Or I'm going to go back to, it's my silent witness, paying attention to the flow of life around me and in me.
You know how you recognize points in time where you're in, and language will come in. It will come in as sure as a tide comes in and reshapes the sand and everything else there, and will leave something. It's a new shape, and it's just the right thing, and on it goes. So we could have done a thing too on just the role of language and the conferences. Maybe we ought to have another one that's on that, because how much fresh language, what a treasure house of language we have inherited.
Well, what we also inherited is a metaphorical way of thinking.
Uh-huh.
We've left the flat concrete world when we go into a men's conference.
Yes.
And we exist in a metaphorical world.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's fake. That doesn't mean it's a lie.
No.
It just has a lot more depth, as the best metaphors and the best poetry do.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's time for me to click this thing off. Well, thank you, Jonathan.
All right, you guys.
Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah, good to talk to you guys.
We'll catch you the next time.
Down the line.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.